Welcome back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1302, and today the topic we'll be covering is that of the Progressive Era. Now, over the course of the past few topics, what we have discussed is that the United States, by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, was an emerging world power. We saw this both economically, militarily, as well as politically. However, while we do see that the nation was beginning to promote its prestige abroad, and while it was emerging as a world-class power, especially in regards to American industry, we do still see that there are several issues back at home. And as Americans become increasingly interested on America becoming a world power, they were also increasingly interested of social issues that we see back at home. And by the beginning of the 20th century, coinciding with what we had seen with American imperialism, there will be a push by Americans to bring about meaningful reform to fix the social and economic issues that we see left over from the Gilded Age. And this is what results in what we call the Progressive Era. Now, by the beginning of the 20th century, there was a renewed interest in pushing forth reform and supporting these individuals that would become known as progressives. Now, the progressives, they're going to support the idea of bringing about social and economic change, and they're looking to use the federal government as their engine. They will promote a more Hamiltonian-style government, a larger federal government, a larger federal bureaucracy, and a more active federal government that would push forth reforms, regulations to begin to stem the growth of these big businesses, most notably of monopolies, to try to recreate capitalism to where there would be competition and you wouldn't see the growth of this wealth gap. Now, with these progressives during this period, though, while they are pushing forth reform, I do want to talk about very briefly that there are going to be some limitations to their practice of progressivism. Unlike modern progressives, they're not going to be very interested in the issue of civil rights. We'll see that with many of the organizations that would be formed during this period that would be associated with the progressives. They would not be interested in promoting rights for African Americans, and also they're going to be uninterested in the large amount of immigrants that are arriving over in the United States. We'll see that most progressives will actually promote a policy to where immigrants should assimilate, and they will begin to establish the foundations for a nativist response that we'll see come to fruition by World War I. So I do want to point that out, but nonetheless they were looking to bring about fundamental change in American society. Now, most of these progressives that we see during this period, what's going to help push forth their message is the fact that they will be much more active in writing books, articles in newspapers, and revealing the darker side of American society that we'd seen in the Gilded Age to the American public. And the main group of progressives that will look to push forth these social issues and bring it directly to the American public is a group known as the Muckrakers. Now, the muckrakers, they're mainly going to be middle as well as upper middle class Americans who are college educated, who are going to begin to document the poor working conditions, sanitary conditions that we see in American factories, as well as the poor living conditions that we see most notably amongst those living within America's inner cities. And they will begin to publish a variety of books. We'll see that Ida Tarbell is going to produce a history of Standard Oil, which will document the rough business practices, if you will, or I should say more the ruthless business practices of Standard Oil under John D. Rockefeller. But more notably, what we'll see is that one of the muckrakers, that of Upton Sinclair, is going to publish a book known as The Jungle, which you'll read about within the lecture slides this week. Now, what's unique about the Muckrakers' work, most notably works like The Jungle, is we do start to see as it brings forth that underbelly of American life within the Gilded Age / the Progressive Era. It begins to show the American people, especially middle-class Americans who weren't fully aware of what we see within these factories, of the poor conditions that we see in many of these factories, in the meatpacking industry, and so on and so forth. In books like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, they would have such a great impact that we'll even see that President Roosevelt, who we'll talk more about here in a second, would push forth reforms to try to resolve these issues. And because of the works of the Muckrakers, as well as many other progressives during this period, we do start to see meaningful regulation and reform being pushed forward. However, even though we do start to see some of this change in a more active federal government in the long run, this is not to say that all issues are going to be resolved. As I mentioned before, progressives aren't going to be overly interested in the welfare of immigrants. And we'll see that many immigrants are going to remain in very poor living as well as working conditions. And by the end of the Progressive Era, there will be a nativist response against these groups to force them to either to assimilate or basically leave the country. And we'll talk about that with the Immigration Acts once we get to the days after World War I. But anyways, nonetheless, we do start to see that there are going to be more reforms that are going to be pushed forth. However, the biggest thing that progressives needed is they did not just need individuals writing about these events, but they needed politicians to be on their sides. And what's going to also characterize this age is that politicians, where during the Gilded Age, they had often sided with big businesses, during this period, we'll see that oftentimes the presidents, more notably, but also other politicians, are going to side with the progressives and bringing about meaningful reform. And so for just a little bit, I want to turn our attention now to the progressive presidents to see how they're going to inaugurate what we would call the modern presidency, but at the same time bring a more active federal government to bring about meaningful reform as well as regulation to businesses. Now, the individual or the first progressive president that's really going to inaugurate this era is going to be that of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, when we last talked about Theodore Roosevelt, he was a hero of the Battle of San Juan Hill, and this effectively is going to eventually propel him to the presidency. Following his victory there, he became a household name, he was widely popular, he became the governor of New York, and he became such a political force that in 1900, when William McKinley needed a vice presidential candidate to run alongside him, he's going to nominate the very young Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt himself, he will be elected to the vice presidency in 1900 with McKinley's win. And shortly thereafterwards, once McKinley enters his second term, we will see that he's going to be shot and assassinated while in office. As a result, Roosevelt, at the very early portions of McKinley's second term, is going to take over and become America's youngest president up to that point in American history. Now, when Roosevelt takes over office, he will enact a more active presidency. And it became clear to big business owners, especially when he delivers a speech before Congress shortly after taking over the presidential office, that he was not going to be on their side in many labor disputes, but rather he was looking to bring about social and economic change. He was the first of these progressives to take over the presidency. Now, the big platform that he's going to push forth that's going to ultimately try to crack down on much of the inequality and the social woes that we had seen develop during the Gilded Age is going to be that of what he would call his Square Deal. So Roosevelt's Square Deal is pretty easy to understand. Basically, what he wants to do is go out on what he would call trust busting. He wants to break up those trusts that had foreign monopolies that had basically stopped competition in its tracks. Now, why is this so important, especially for the American economy and diminishing that wealth gap? Well, if we remember, with the rise of monopolies, as they begin to create a monopoly over an industry, they could control prices as they deem fit. However, if you were to break up these trusts, if you were to break up these monopolies, you'd have more companies, i.e. more competition, and for American consumers, prices would begin to diminish and go down. And therefore, Roosevelt, to try to do this, is going to go on trust busting. He's going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to his advantage, and during the course of his administration, he would look to break up at least 44 different companies. And he would be widely successful. And big businesses started to realize that the president was no longer really in their pocketbooks during this period. And we'll see further presidents moving forward with Taft as well as Wilson. They'll continue to pursue this end of trust busting and restoring American capitalism. However, that would not be the only issue that Roosevelt would champion during his administration that would push forth progressive reforms. We'd also see that he'd bring about more regulation in regards to America's various industries. First, we'll see the Hepburn Act, which is going to give more power to the ICC, so that way we have fair railway rates that were being practiced on the railroads. Also, what we'd see more notably, in the light of books like The Jungle, by the time Roosevelt takes his second presidential term, he would support both the Meat Inspection as well as the Pure Food and Drugs Act. Now, because of the work The Jungle in 1906, what we'd see is Roosevelt would help push forth both the Meat Inspection as well as the Pure Food and Drug Acts, which was meant to regulate those respective industries. In regards to the Meat Inspection Act, to make sure that there was proper sanitary regulations in place for many meat inspecting companies, and for the Pure Food and Drug Acts, what we also saw was a major issue with the lack of government regulation. We do start to see that many companies, including Coca-Cola, weren't entirely truthful in dictating to the American public public what were the ingredients of their products. And under the Pure Food and Drugs Act, this would look to sue those companies if they weren't truthful. Ultimately, Coca-Cola would be one of those. But anyways, we'd see that all these regulations would become widely popular amongst the American public because it looks like there is actually something being done. And it looks like we're starting to see improvements within working conditions, within the industrial sector that we had not seen during the Gilded Age. Also, what we'd see under the Roosevelt administration, he would take the side of labor in regards to labor disputes. He would promote this idea known as collective bargaining, to where companies needed to negotiate with labor unions, with their employees, so that way they could make sure that the American economy could continue to run and to avoid strikes. Now, in several cases, there will be some strikes that would emerge under the Roosevelt administration. And most notably in 1902, when one of these strikes emerges amongst the coal mining industry in Western Virginia, when these coal mine companies approach Roosevelt to intervene on their behalf, he's going to counter and side with labor. And this is something that we'll see characteristic of these presidents during this period. And it will begin to improve the power of labor unions as well as the labor movement in general. Now, because of all these policies, we'll see that Roosevelt, he'll become widely popular. And in 1904, when he runs for re-election, he's going to be easily re-elected. And during his second presidential term, alongside supporting the Pure Food and Drugs Act as well as the Meat Inspection Act, he's also going to continue to promote a policy it somewhat began to promote during his first administration, but will become more characteristic of his second presidential term, that of conservation. Now, Roosevelt was a big proponent of conservation. One, he was an outdoorsman himself, and he wanted to ensure that the American landscape, especially nature, would be preserved for future generations. And he would look to bring about some sort of regulation to preserve America's landscape, especially its natural resources. Now, in regards to this arena, this is where the U.S. is going to be ahead of much of the globe in pushing forth reforms. Now, during the Gilded Age, what we had seen is with the lack of regulation, many companies, whether it was, say, Standard Oil or was one of these mining companies, they were beginning to deplete America's natural resources supply. However, once we get to the Roosevelt administration, and even slightly before, we'll start to see that Congress is going to enact regulations so that way there would be some land set aside to preserve America's natural resources, so they wouldn't run out during this industrial age. And Roosevelt will really begin to ramp up these efforts, begin to create national reserves, lay the foundations for the National Park Service, and so on and so forth. And he'll become widely popular for this as well as the policies that we mentioned prior to it. Now, by 1908, as we see his second presidential term come to a close and we're approaching another presidential election, Roosevelt, even though he is widely popular, and even though there was no restrictions from him running for another term, he's going to decide to step down. And as a result, we'll see, though, even though he decides to step down, he's going to handpick his successor for the Republican nomination, that of William Howard Taft. Now, William Howard Taft, when he runs on the Republican ticket, because of his association with Roosevelt and because he's promising to carry on Roosevelt's legacy, we will see that he will easily win the presidency in 1908. And in many ways, Taft will carry on many of the policies that we had seen during the Roosevelt administration, especially in regards to trust busting. However, as Taft begins to promote policies like trust busting that were very familiar with Roosevelt, and he'll actually be more aggressive in regards to breaking up trust, we'll also see that Taft is going to be more conservative than Roosevelt, especially when it comes to conservation. And this is where we'll see a split between Roosevelt as well as Taft. In regards to conservation, what we'll see is that Taft, he wasn't very hot on the idea. He's going to begin to sell some natural reserves over to major companies, and this is going to lead to a split between him and Roosevelt, bringing Roosevelt out of retirement. And when we come up to the presidential election of 1912, Roosevelt wants to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination. However, Roosevelt himself will not gain the Republican nomination, and as a result, he will go off and run on a third-party ticket of what he would ultimately dub the Progressive Party. Now, what will characterize the election of 1912 is a split within the Republican Party, and we'll see that Roosevelt, even though he forms his own third party, he would prove to be a very formidable opponent. And we'll see that many Republicans would often flock to Roosevelt's side for this upcoming election. And there was a real possibility that the Progressive Party could disrupt presidential politics. Now, in the meantime, though, it won't just be Taft and Roosevelt that would be running for the presidency in 1912. We'll see running alongside them would be the Democratic nominee, Woodrow Wilson, who would promote his what he would call his New Freedom platform, a more conservative approach to progressivism, to where he would look to enforce antitrust acts as well as antitrust laws, and not really expand the federal government, but use current legislation to smash up trust, to smash up monopolies, and restore capitalism, and to help improve Americans' lives. And then finally, there would be a fourth candidate involved in this election, that of Eugene Debs, who would be running as a part of the Socialist ticket. And even though the Socialist Party, while it may not have been popular amongst most Americans, we'll see almost about 10% of Americans during this presidential election are going to vote for the Socialist Party. However, while there are all these candidates, really it's going to fall between Roosevelt or Wilson for the presidency. I already told you what Wilson will be running on with his New Freedom platform, but Roosevelt will counter it with what he would call his New Nationalism platform, where he would look to expand the federal government, basically regulate prices, especially in regards to the railway industry, something he had begun under the Hepburn Act. And he would look to expand rights to women, voting rights especially to women, as well as a number of other policies. And if you look at the exact platform, which you'll read about within your textbook this week, you will see that it looks strikingly similar to the Socialist Party, and this is where Roosevelt's not going to try to really combat the Socialist Party out on the campaign trail, because he realizes this may make his platform relatively unpopular. But anyways, even though there will be some theatrics during this campaign, and even Roosevelt himself will be shot, and this is where he'll famously deliver a 2.5-hour-long speech after he's shot, in the end, the individual who's going to win the election in 1912 is going to be Woodrow Wilson. Now, how did the Democrats retake the White House, especially with the popularity of the Republicans during this period? Well, it's pretty simple. When Roosevelt challenged Taft and created his own third party, he effectively split the Republican vote. And as a result, it cleared the pathway for Wilson to take the presidential office. And when you take a look at the electoral map this week for 1912, even though Wilson only gained 42% of the popular vote, because of the fact there was a split in the Republican ticket, this is why he'll take the election. And though he had campaigned on a more conservative approach to progressivism, we'll see that much of what he would enact during his administration will look very similar to what Roosevelt had been promoting as a part of his New Nationalism platform. So under the Wilson administration, he would live up to his promises that he had promoted on the campaign trail. He would promote, which I should have mentioned a moment ago, lowering tariffs. We also see that he would pass the Clinton Antitrust Act, which would also more heavily enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act and break up trust. But we'd also see that he would continue to expand the role of the federal government. And we'd see that he would continue to expand the federal bureaucracy. Most notably, we'll see this with the Federal Reserve System that would be constructed under Wilson, which would take the financial situation of the United States out of the banking industry and put it into the hands of the federal government. We'd also see that alongside this, he would promote two amendments during his administration. First, the 16th Amendment, which would begin to be passed during the Taft administration, but eventually ratified during Wilson's administration, which would promote an income tax, so that way the wealthy would pay their fair share. And then the 17th Amendment, which would bring about genuine democracy for most Americans, allowing for the direct election of U.S. senators, something we did not see prior to this period. Not to mention, we'll also see that he would enact a child labor law that would ensure that Americans under the age of 15, or I should say children under the age of 15, should not work. And then also we'd see that he would begin to promote an 8-hour workday, 40-hour work week through an act for the railway industry. And so in many ways, much of his administration is going to align with what we had seen promoted with Roosevelt's platform. We'll also see that there would be further constitutional amendments passed during his administration, but we'll talk about that when we get past World War I. But anyways, as his administration was passing these amendments, I do want to point out that the Wilson administration, even though it's very progressive for some Americans, it will be the opposite for many others. Most notably in regards to African Americans, we'd see that the Wilson administration would not be a friend of that community. We'd see that he would pass laws at the federal level that would segregate the federal government, and so on and so forth. So it does demonstrate to us the limits of not only Wilson's progressivism, but progressivism during the era. But anyways, as we see these progressive presidents begin to bring about change, we do continue to still see, though, that there are a lot of social issues remaining during the progressive era, many that won't be solved for decades to come. Now, the last issue I do want to talk about, which will come under the Wilson administration and would eventually lead to the passage of a constitutional amendment, is going to be that of women's suffrage. even before the Wilson administration, we have seen throughout American history, ever since 1848, there had been a significant push for women's suffrage as well as for women's rights. However, all throughout the 19th century, this issue was really put on the back burner for many American politicians who didn't really take the issue very seriously. However, in some regions out in the West, we will see some states will begin to grant women the right to vote. However, at the federal level, we haven't seen an act passed that would grant universal suffrage. But that will change by the time we get to the beginning of the 20th century. And what brings about that change? Well, mainly the women's suffrage movement prior to the 20th century had been led by women from the elite class. However, after the 20th century, we'll start to see that middle as well as lower class women will increasingly become interested in pursuing this issue of suffrage, especially as we started to see that a large portion of the workforce, about 25% if I remember correctly, will consist of women. And as they were gaining economic independence, they were looking to pursue political independence. And during the 20th century, we'd see that the women's suffrage movement would gain a powerful ally in Alice Paul. Now, Alice Paul would be one of the collegiately educated women that we see during this period, who would actually be educated over in Europe, who came into contact with the women's suffrage movement there, which was much more aggressive than what we'd see over in the United States. After seeing them, Alice Paul, she would then come back to the U.S. by the 1910s, form the National Women's Party, and apply more aggressive methods to try to gain women's suffrage. This would include having picket lines in front of the White House, especially in the midst of World War I, having women chain themselves to the gates of the White House, and then also once they were arrested, conducting hunger strikes. And all these things would begin to raise awareness for women's suffrage, and by the time we get to the end of World War I, we will see that there will be an amendment passed and ratified by the United States bringing about universal suffrage. This will be that of the 19th Amendment. Now, the 19th Amendment, it will be passed shortly after World War I, and I'll discuss more about that once we get to the days after World War I, but it would grant universal suffrage for women. And in the first election they would participate in 1920, they would make up 40% of the electorate, and this is going to drastically transform American presidential elections. However, we'll talk more about that in the future. But anyways, as we do start to see movements like women's suffrage begin to emerge, and we do see a lot of change begin to occur within American society in regards to regulations and reforms, there is one last issue I do want to bring up, because while we do see America change socially, economically, it's also going to begin to change, because by the beginning of the 20th century, we will see the emergence of a consumer economy. Now, during the Gilded Age, we saw that the American economy was based off of industrial goods, but that begins to change by the 20th century, because we will see that many Americans were growing interested in consuming consumer products. Things like radios, as we'll see over time. Things like going off to movies, watching films that were beginning to be produced, and more notably purchasing automobiles. And this was because we start to see that by the beginning of the 20th century, the American economy is going to be more interested in mass producing their goods, especially through this policy known as Fordism. Now, Fordism, it really comes to light under Henry Ford at the Ford Motor Company. And many of you are probably familiar with the name Ford, which is synonymous with automobiles. Now, Henry Ford, whenever he does open his doors to the Ford Motor Company, automobiles were nothing new. They had been in existence for the previous 20 years. However, they were extremely expensive, and the only people that could purchase them were members of the upper class. And Henry Ford is going to try to resolve this issue by trying to expand his consumer base, to expand his profits by mass producing his goods, to drive down prices. And hence, this is where he's going to introduce the assembly line, to where he can construct his Model T as quickly as possible, so that way it could be sold as quickly as possible and drive down prices. As a result, most Americans will be able to purchase an automobile, and this will only amplify the profits of Henry Ford. On top of that, also a part of Fordism, he would begin to pay his employees a little bit more, because he realized that they were vital in continuing this consumer economy and feeding his profits. And we'll see many were critical of this method at first, but over time they will begin to adopt it with their industries. And a consumer economy begins to emerge during this period. However, it will only rapidly accelerate by the time we get to the 1920s, but we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But anyways, with everything that we discussed so far, I think this is a good ending point for us on the Progressive Era, and we'll go ahead and we'll end the lecture on that note. But anyways, before we go ahead and leave, just like always, make sure you go and complete all assignments, read all the topic readings, articles, the textbook chapter, as well as watch all the videos for this week. If you do have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out. But anyways, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see you all in the next lecture.